For 20 years, I sacrificed everything to save my family's empire, only for them to secretly vote me out and leave me with crushing debt. They smiled, thinking I was completely ruined, but they made one fatal mistake. Less than 24 hours later, I was handed the keys to a $30 million Malibu mansion and a secret that changed absolutely everything. The same family that threw me away had no idea. They just made me their landlord. Make sure you watch until the very end to see exactly how their arrogance became their ultimate downfall. Before we continue, please take a quick second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from today. I absolutely love seeing where my viewers are tuning in from. Now, let's get into the story. I used to believe that blood was a bond you could trust blindly. For 20 years, I poured every ounce of my energy, my youth, and my sanity into family enterprise. While my friends were building families, buying homes, and taking weekend trips, I was staring at spreadsheets at 2 in the morning, desperately trying to keep our legacy from crumbling. I sacrificed my own dreams to ensure my mother and my younger siblings never had to know the bitter taste of financial ruin. I carried the weight of our world on my shoulders, believing that one day my loyalty would be recognized and respected. That day finally arrived, or so I thought. It was a Tuesday morning, the rain beating heavily against the tall glass windows of our corporate boardroom. This was supposed to be the day I was officially named CEO. The transition had been promised to me a decade ago. I walked into that room with a sense of quiet pride, holding a leather folder filled with strategies to take us into the next quarter. But the moment I saw my mother sitting at the head of the table, flanked by our corporate lawyers and my younger brother, David, the air in the room felt terribly thin. David was a golden child, a boy who had never worked a hard day in his life. Yet there he sat, wearing a tailored suit bought with the very company funds I had bled to secure. My mother didn't even look me in the eye when she called the meeting to order. In a matter of minutes, the reality I had constructed for 2 decades was brutally dismantled. There was no promotion. There was no passing of the torch. Instead, there was a surprise vote. Behind my back, over the course of 6 agonizing months, they had secretly restructured the entire corporate entity. They voted to remove me from the executive board entirely. When I asked for an explanation, my mother simply folded her hands on a mahogany table and stated that the company needed fresh, dynamic leadership. They were giving total control to David. The betrayal wasn't just professional. It was a calculated financial execution. When I demanded my equity buyout, the lawyers slid a thick stack of documents across the table. Through a labyrinth of legal loopholes and shell agreements my mother had orchestrated, my shares had been diluted to absolutely nothing. Worse still, the personal loans I had taken out under my own name to keep our supply chain afloat during the lean years were entirely my burden. They were legally terminating me with 0 severance, 0 equity, and crushing debt. I looked at the people I shared DNA with, the people I had given my life to protect, and saw nothing but cold, predatory strangers. David didn't even have the decency to look guilty. He actually smirked. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table or beg for my position. The shock was too absolute, too profound for anger. I simply closed my leather folder, stood up, and walked out of the room. The silence that followed me out the door was the loudest sound I've ever heard. I took the elevator down to the lobby and stepped out onto the unforgiving city pavement. The cold rain soaked instantly through my coat, but I barely felt it. I stood there on the curb, staring into the gray traffic, a person approaching 50 with no job, a mountain of debt, and a shattered heart. I had sacrificed everything for the illusion of family, only to realize I was never their family. I was just their shield, and now that they didn't need me, they had thrown me to the wolves. I spent the entire night sitting in the dark of my cramped living room, watching the shadows stretch and fade across the ceiling. I didn't sleep a single second. The reality of absolute bankruptcy was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I spent those agonizing hours mentally calculating which meager assets I could liquidate first to cover the immediate loan defaults, dreading the moment the sun would rise. When my phone finally buzzed at 8 o'clock in the morning, I almost didn't answer it. I assumed it was the bank, or perhaps my mother calling to deliver one final, calculated insult. But the screen displayed an unfamiliar, private number. On the other end was a crisp professional voice belonging to a senior partner at an elite wealth management firm. He didn't ask if I was available. He simply stated that a car was waiting outside my building and that it was absolutely imperative I come with him immediately. With quite literally nothing left to lose, I walked out into the crisp morning air and climbed into the back of a sleek, black town car. The driver didn't speak. He simply pulled away from the curb and eventually merged onto the Pacific Coast Highway, heading north. As the endless, glittering expanse of the ocean opened up to my left, the sheer, breathtaking beauty of the coastline felt almost like a cruel joke compared to the absolute wreckage of my personal life. I had no idea where we were going. I expected a sterile, glass-walled corporate office in Century City. Instead, nearly an hour later, the car slowed and turned off the highway, stopping before a pair of towering wrought iron security gates. They swung open silently, revealing a winding driveway flanked by perfectly manicured gardens and ancient olive trees. At the top of the cliff sat an architectural masterpiece. It was a sprawling, multi-tiered white mansion, its vast glass walls reflecting the morning sun directly over the water. It was a $30 million sanctuary, completely secluded from the noise of the world. The front doors were already open. Standing in the grand, sunlit foyer was a stoic, older gentleman in a tailored gray suit. He introduced himself as Arthur Pendleton, an attorney and executor of his estate. He didn't offer empty condolences or unnecessary small talk. He just looked at me with a quiet, profound respect and motioned for me to follow him into a massive library overlooking the crashing waves below. He gestured to a leather armchair and delivered the news that stopped the breath in my throat. This entire estate, he explained calmly, belonged to my late Aunt Eleanor. The name hit me like a physical blow. Eleanor. For as long as I could remember, my mother and the rest of the family had painted Eleanor as a vicious, unstable black sheep. She had been banished from the family circle decades ago, described as a chaotic pariah who had tried to ruin our name before vanishing into obscurity. I was raised to view her with pity and disgust. Yet here I was, sitting in her palatial, immaculate home. Arthur reached into his briefcase and placed 2 items on the heavy oak desk between us. The first was a beautifully crafted antique skeleton key. The second was a sleek, high-tech digital tablet. He looked me dead in the eye and explained that the deed to the mansion was already legally in my name, entirely debt-free, alongside a substantial trust to maintain the property. I stared at him, my mind spinning, waiting for the trap to snap shut. And there was a condition. He explained that the estate was merely a fraction of my inheritance, to unlock the remainder of what Eleanor had left behind. And to finally understand why I had been brought here, I had to watch the encrypted video diaries loaded onto that tablet. The skeleton key, he added softly, would make sense soon enough, without another word. Arthur stood up, shook my trembling hand, and walked out, leaving me completely alone in the silent, echoing mansion that was now my home. The silence of the mansion was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crash of the Pacific against the cliffs below. I sat in the center of the vast library, the heavy oak desk anchoring me to a reality I could scarcely comprehend. The antique skeleton key felt cold and weighty in my palm, a physical artifact from a past I had been taught to despise. I picked up the digital tablet. The screen glowed to life with a single tap, displaying an encrypted file labeled simply with my name. My hand hovered over the glass for a long, breathless moment before I finally pressed play. The video flickered, and suddenly I was looking into the eyes of a ghost. Aunt Eleanor sat in the very same leather armchair I now occupied, but the woman on the screen bore no resemblance to the erratic, vicious pariah my mother had described in hushed, scornful tones over decades of Sunday dinners. This woman was elegant, fiercely intelligent, and possessed a quiet, commanding dignity. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her dark eyes held profound, recognizable sorrow. When she spoke, her voice was steady, wrapping around me with an unexpected warmth. "If you are watching this," she began softly, "it means the inevitable has finally happened. They have done to you exactly what they did to me." I leaned closer to the screen, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Eleanor didn't waste time on pleasantries or vague regrets. She explained that the stories I've been fed since childhood, the narrative of her madness, her greed, and her sudden voluntary disappearance, were nothing more than a meticulously crafted fabrication. She instructed me to take the antique key, walk to the eastern wall of the library, and press the hidden wooden latch behind the portrait of the stormy seascape. I paused the video. My legs felt heavy, almost numb, as I crossed the room, tracing my fingers along the rich mahogany wainscoting. Just as she had promised, a small, seamless panel gave way beneath my touch, revealing a vintage, brass-plated wall safe embedded in the stone. The skeleton key slid into the lock perfectly. With a deep, satisfying metallic click, the heavy door swung open. Inside lay a stack of yellowing, neatly bound folders. I carried them back to the desk, my hands trembling as I untied the first one. They were found in contracts and original engineering patents dating back over 35 years. As I scanned the faded ink and the official government seals, my breath caught in my throat. The patents, the very technological innovations that had built our family's multi-million-dollar empire, did not bear my father's signature. They didn't bear my mother's name. Every single document, every foundational blueprint that had launched the company was registered under one name alone: Eleanor Vance. I pressed play on the tablet once more. Eleanor's voice filled the room, heavy with the weight of decades of forced silence. She explained how she had been the true architect of the family's wealth, the sole visionary behind the enterprise. But as the money began to pour in, my mother and father orchestrated a ruthless boardroom coup. Using the same legal loopholes and vicious character assassinations I had just experienced, they stripped her of her shares and cast her out into the cold. She hadn't abandoned us. She was excised by the very people who were now feasting on her genius. As I sat there, surrounded by the undeniable proof of her brilliance, the foundation of my entire existence shattered. The enterprise I had sacrificed my youth to protect was a monument to theft. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that a betrayal I had suffered yesterday in that rain-slicked boardroom was not an isolated tragedy. It was a dark, generational tradition. I had spent 20 years defending a lie, and Aunt Eleanor had left me the truth. It took exactly 72 hours for the vultures to find me. In the insulated, cutthroat world of elite finance, secrets rarely survive the weekend. Word had already leaked that the disgraced, newly terminated executive of a struggling family enterprise had just taken possession of a $30 million coastal fortress. I was sitting in the quiet sanctuary of the library, carefully reviewing the fragile, 30-year-old patents Eleanor had left behind, when the sharp, intrusive buzz of the security system shattered the morning peace. The estate guard's voice came through the speaker, tight with professional hesitation, informing me that a highly agitated group of people was demanding immediate access at the main gate. I walked over to the sleek security console mounted near the mahogany doors and activated the high-definition camera feeds. The screen flickered to life, and a bitter laugh caught in the back of my throat. Pacing furiously on the asphalt outside my wrought iron barrier was my mother. Standing just a few feet behind her was David, the newly minted COO, looking utterly out his depth and clutching a leather briefcase as if it were a life raft. Two of their most aggressive corporate litigators flanked them. It was a desperate, disorganized ambush. I watched my mother berate the impassive security guard for another moment before I reached out and pressed the two-way intercom button. My voice, calm and amplified, echoed from the stone pillars down at the entrance. I told them to step away from the gate. My mother's head snapped up toward the camera lens. The polished, unbothered matriarch who had coldly stripped me of my livelihood just days ago was entirely gone. Her face was flushed with frantic outrage. She didn't offer a greeting, nor did she feign remorse. Instead, she immediately launched into the weaponized guilt she had used to control my every move for the last 20 years. She shrieked that Aunt Eleanor was a thief, that this magnificent estate had been purchased with stolen family money, and that I was harboring illicit assets. Her demands were as transparent as they were audacious. She ordered me to open the gates, threatening to unleash a firestorm of litigation that would ruin me forever if I didn't immediately sign the deed of the property over to the family business. She claimed it was my fundamental duty to surrender my inheritance to save them all from the financial crisis. In the past, that sharp, commanding tone would have triggered a visceral, submissive panic in my chest. I would have scrambled to fix the crisis, eager to sacrifice my own well-being to prove my unwavering loyalty to the family. But standing in Eleanor's house, insulated by the heavy stone walls and the absolute, undeniable proof of their generational deceit, the spell was definitively broken. I looked at the monitor, observing the panic poorly disguised as authority. They weren't here to bully me out of spite. They were here out of sheer terror. The company was sinking faster than they had anticipated, and they wanted to cannibalize my unexpected sanctuary to plug the holes in their collapsing empire. I leaned close to the microphone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue, and I certainly didn't defend Eleanor's honor to the people who had stolen it. I simply told my mother that her authority no longer applied to my life. I calmly informed her that if she or her lawyers felt they had any legitimate claims, they could direct them to the estate's legal counsel. Then, with a single, deliberate press of a button, I severed the audio connection. I stood in the quiet library and watched on the silent monitor as my mother stood frozen in absolute disbelief, her mouth open, while David nervously backed away from the iron bars. For the first time in my entire life, the power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had permanently shattered. Watching my mother's car retreat down the Pacific Coast Highway didn't bring me a sense of victory, but it brought me something far more valuable: absolute clarity. The phantom obligation that had chained me to that family for a lifetime had vanished into the ocean air. Yet, as I walked back to the heavy oak desk and picked up the digital tablet, a cold instinct told me the foundation of their lives was much deeper than stolen engineering patents. I tapped the glass screen, and the second encrypted video file flickered to life. Aunt Eleanor appeared once again, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. She spoke as if she had watched the frantic confrontation at the security gates herself. She warned me that desperate people make careless mistakes, and my mother had been making them for 3 decades. Eleanor's instructions were precise. She told me to leave the comfort of the library, take the service elevator down to the lowest level of the estate, and enter a specific passcode into the steel door at the end of the subterranean hall. I followed her voice into the depths of the mansion. The sunlit, antique elegance of the upper floors gave way to a stark, climate-controlled corridor. At the end of it, a heavy, reinforced door beeped in submission to the sequence I punched into the keypad. I stepped inside to find not a dusty wine cellar, but a state-of-the-art server room. Racks of encrypted hard drives hummed in the cool, filtered air, a hidden nerve center buried beneath the Malibu cliffs. Resting on a solitary metal desk in the center of the room was a single laptop, already logged into a massive, securely hosted database. Eleanor's recorded voice echoed from the tablet in my hand, guiding me to open the master directory. What I found on that glowing screen was an absolute masterpiece of forensic accounting. For 30 years, Eleanor had quietly, meticulously tracked every single transaction, every offshore transfer, and every hidden ledger my mother had ever touched. The stolen patents were only the beginning. The true anchor of their wealth, the massive capital injection used to initially scale the business, came directly from my grandfather. My eyes rapidly scanned the digitized bank records and sealed court documents. My mother had always claimed our grandfather died penniless, leaving our family burdened with his remaining debts. It was a founding myth of our family's fabricated struggle. But staring at the screen, the devastating truth was laid bare. I opened a subfolder containing my grandfather's original, unaltered will alongside a secondary, doctored version. 30 years ago, my mother had forged a signature. She had systematically erased Eleanor from the estate, funneled the vast inheritance into her own shadow accounts, and used it to launch the empire she now claimed was built on her own sheer brilliance. It was a staggering, calculated crime. I sank into the metal chair, the chilling reality of my mother's lifelong ruthlessness washing over me. But it was Eleanor's next words that shattered my heart completely. Her voice softened on the recording. She confessed that after she was banished, she didn't just monitor the company, she monitored me. She had seen my endless late nights, the canceled vacations, the crushing personal debt I took on to keep our supply chains moving during the lean years. She knew every single sacrifice I made to protect a family that was fundamentally parasitic. She spoke with profound, aching sorrow, telling me she had wanted to intervene 1,000 times. But she knew that if she reached out, my ingrained loyalty to our mother would have blinded me to the truth. I had to experience their betrayal with my own eyes. Eleanor had spent decades building this financial fortress, waiting for the inevitable day they would bleed me dry and discard me, just as they had done to her. She hadn't just left me an inheritance. She had spent a lifetime weaving a safety net to catch me when the illusion finally broke. I remained sitting in the pale, blue glow of the server room monitors, the chilled, filtered air raising goosebumps on my arms. The digital tablet felt heavy with consequence as I loaded the third encrypted file. When Eleanor appeared on the screen this time, the sorrow in her eyes had been replaced by something entirely different. It was a look of razor-sharp, formidable calculation. She spoke in a measured tone, stating that simply surviving in exile was enough. She needed to ensure that when the bill for my mother's arrogance finally came due, someone trustworthy would be holding the ledger. She asked me to look closely at the massive corporate restructure my mother and David had executed behind my back over the past 5 years. The years they repeatedly claimed the market was simply experiencing a natural downturn. I knew our profit margins had been razor thin. I had worked 80-hour weeks, missing every personal milestone of my adult life, trying to plug the relentless holes in our cash flow. What I didn't know, because they had intentionally walled me off in the core commercial real estate portfolios, was how they had truly kept the enterprise afloat. To fund David's lavish, unearned executive lifestyle and to maintain my mother's insatiable, prideful need for expansion, they had quietly liquidated the company's foundational assets. The data on the screen proved it. They had sold off our primary manufacturing hubs, our sprawling distribution centers, and eventually the towering glass and steel headquarters in the financial district. They had opted for desperate, high-interest leaseback agreements just to generate the illusion of liquidity. They were renting the very empire they claimed to own. Eleanor's voice brought my attention back to her face. She explained that when predators grow desperate, they become incredibly blind to their surroundings. Years ago, utilizing the immense wealth she had built on her own, Eleanor had established a labyrinthine, anonymous holding company. It was a ghost corporation buried beneath ironclad non-disclosure agreements, offshore trusts, and elite legal proxies. When my mother so eagerly auctioned off the ground beneath their feet to anonymous corporate buyers, she had absolutely no idea she was selling it to the sister she had ruthlessly erased. Every aggressive lease agreement, every exorbitant late fee, every crippling interest rate my mother had signed in her arrogance had been strategically orchestrated by Eleanor. The final puzzle piece locked into place with profound, almost terrifying snap. Eleanor looked directly into the camera, her eyes blazing with quiet, absolute triumph. She told me to open the master ownership directory on the server. My hand was visibly shaking as I clicked the mouse. There, in stark, undeniable legal language, were the immediate transfer documents. The Malibu estate was merely a physical refuge, a place to rest my head. The true inheritance was the ghost corporation itself. I sat back in the metal chair, the breath completely knocked out of my lungs as the reality of my new existence settled over me. I wasn't just independently wealthy. I was the anonymous entity holding the commercial leases for every single square foot of the family enterprise. The people who had fired me in the rain, who had stripped me of my life's work and saddled me with crippling personal debt, had unknowingly handed me the instrument of their own destruction. They were currently months behind on their rent to an anonymous landlord, and I was that landlord. I was their primary debt holder. For the first time in my life, I held absolute, unmitigated power over the people who had tried to ruin me. 2 weeks after my discovery in the server room, my phone vibrated with a message I had fully anticipated. It was my mother. The text was masterfully crafted, layered with the exact kind of manufactured warmth she used whenever she was backed into a corner. She wrote that the family was fractured, that mistakes had been made in the heat of the transition, and that she desperately wanted to make things right. She asked me to meet her for a private reconciliation dinner in an exclusive, dimly lit restaurant downtown. I knew it was a lie. My legal proxies had just informed me that the family enterprise was officially 90 days in default on their corporate leases. They were drowning, and the anonymous landlord was tightening the noose. I wore a simple suit and arrived exactly on time. The maitre d' escorted me to a secluded private dining room in the back. As the heavy velvet curtains parted, The illusion of a heartfelt family reunion instantly evaporated. My mother was not alone. David was sitting beside her, nervously tearing a paper coaster to shreds. Flanking them were the same two aggressive corporate litigators who had flanked my mother at the mansion gates. It wasn't a dinner. It was an ambush. I took my seat across from them and ordered a single black coffee. My mother didn't waste any time. She reached across the table, attempting to place her hand over mine, but I quietly pulled back. Without missing a beat, she triggered the tears. It was a performance I had witnessed 100 times throughout my childhood, a weaponized display of maternal grief meant to break my boundaries and secure my compliance. She wept about family legacy, about the sacrifices of our ancestors, and how blood must always stand united against the storms of life. Then, the lead litigator seamlessly took over, sliding a prepared legal document across the pristine white tablecloth. My mother dabbed her eyes and delivered the punchline. The company, she confessed with a dramatic sigh, was experiencing a temporary cash flow crisis. To save the family name, they needed an immediate, massive influx of capital. They wanted me to liquidate Aunt Eleanor's Malibu estate and sign the proceeds over to the corporate general fund. It was framed as an honorable duty, a chance for me to prove my loyalty and save us all from ruin. I sat perfectly still, listening to the ice clink in David's water glass. I looked at the legal document, then at the litigators, and finally at my mother. A profound, unshakable calm settled over me. In the past, the sheer weight of their collective disappointment would have crushed me into submission, but I wasn't the broken, discarded child they thought they were manipulating. I was the ghost corporation. I was the very entity they were terrified of. I knew exactly how deep their financial grave was, because I was the one holding the shovel. I didn't yell. I didn't dramatically reveal my hand or explain that they were begging their own landlord for a bailout. I simply looked into my mother's eyes and told her that my inheritance was not a life raft for her sinking ship. I pushed the unsigned document back across the table. Reaching into my jacket, I pulled out $100 bill, laid it neatly next to my untouched coffee, and stood up. The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating terror. They had played their final, desperate card, and it had completely failed. Without another word, I walked out of the restaurant, leaving them trapped in the nightmare of their own making. I drove back up the coast that evening, the ocean completely black under a moonless sky. The air inside the Malibu estate felt entirely different now. It was no longer just a quiet refuge. It was a command center. I poured a glass of water, walked into the vast library, and woke up the digital tablet one last time. There was only one encrypted file left. I tapped the screen, and Aunt Eleanor appeared for her final message. She looked remarkably peaceful in this last recording, as if the heavy burden she had carried for decades had finally been lifted. She didn't speak about corporate strategy, hidden ledgers, or anonymous holding companies. Instead, she spoke about the invisible chains we allow others to wrap around our necks. She said that society teaches us to revere biology, to believe that sharing DNA is a sacred contract requiring infinite forgiveness and unending sacrifice. But she had learned the hard way that toxic loyalty is the most dangerous poison a person can drink. Real family, she explained with gentle firmness, is built on mutual respect and protection, not weaponized guilt and endless demands. She urged me to look at my life not as a tragedy of betrayal, but as a profound opportunity to break a generational curse. She had laid the financial foundation, but I had to be the one to sever the emotional chain forever. Her final words were simple, yet they echoed in the quiet room long after the screen faded to black. She looked directly into the lens and whispered, "Do not save them. Save yourself." The next morning, I sat at the head of the heavy oak desk in the library, joined by Arthur Pendleton and the rest of Eleanor's elite legal proxy team. The air in the room was sharp, efficient, and strictly professional. Arthur opened a thick leather binder and laid out the current financial standing of my mother's enterprise. Following the failed ambush at the restaurant, their corporate litigators had officially filed an emergency request with our anonymous holding company. They were begging for a 90-day extension on their defaulted leases. They were utterly desperate, offering to mortgage whatever meager secondary assets they had left just to keep the lights on in their downtown headquarters. Arthur looked at me over the rim of his glasses, his silver pen hovering above the approval line. He asked, in a perfectly neutral, measured tone, how I wished to proceed. I looked down at the neatly typed legal requests. For 20 years, my default response to their panic had been to accommodate, to absorb the pain and take on the debt so my family wouldn't have to face the consequences of their own arrogance. I thought about the freezing rain on the day they terminated me, leaving me with nothing but crushing liabilities. I thought about the fabricated, manipulative tears at the restaurant, and I thought about Eleanor, exiled and erased, building a fortress in shadows just to give me a chance at true freedom. I reached out and took the heavy fountain pen from Arthur's hand. I didn't feel angry, and I didn't feel a petty thirst for vengeance. I felt absolute, crystal clear justice. I instructed Arthur to deny the extension entirely. I turned to the next page and pressed a gold nib to the thick paper, signing my name with a steady, unwavering hand. With those few deliberate strokes of ink, I officially initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings and a complete commercial eviction on the towering glass and steel headquarters of the family business. Arthur carefully blotted the signatures, closed the binder with a definitive snap, and nodded. The gears of their ruin were now officially in motion. My mother and David were about to receive their final eviction notices from the anonymous landlord they had been dreading. The stage was set, and it was finally time for me to step out of the shadows. The glass walls of the downtown headquarters looked exactly the same as they had on the day I was thrown out into the rain. The only difference was that today, I wasn't arriving as a desperate subordinate. I was arriving as the executioner. My mother, David, and the remaining sycophants on the board of directors had scrambled to arrange an emergency meeting with the representatives of the anonymous holding company. Arthur Pendleton had informed their legal counsel that the primary shareholder would be attending in person to finalize the eviction terms. When Arthur and I stepped off the private elevator onto the executive floor, the tension in the air was palpable. I paused just outside the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. Through the glass, I could see my mother sitting at the head of the mahogany table, her posture rigid, her chin tilted up in that familiar, arrogant defiance. David sat beside her, nervously whispering to their lead litigator. They were prepared to bluff, to threaten, and to bully their way out of the corner they had painted themselves into. They truly believed they were about to face a room full of faceless corporate suits they could manipulate or outsmart. Arthur reached out and pushed open the heavy doors. I walked in, my footsteps echoing against the polished floor, completely shattering the silence. The reaction was instantaneous. The arrogant smirk vanished from David's face, instantly replaced by a pale, slack-jawed horror. The corporate litigators looked confused, shuffling their papers and glancing at the door. But my mother's reaction was the most profound. Her eyes widened, darting from my face to Arthur Pendleton. In a fraction of a second, the terrifying, suffocating realization of what was happening crashed down upon her. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to scold me for interrupting a closed-door meeting, but her voice completely failed her. I didn't take a seat. I stood at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, looking directly at the woman who had stolen my youth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply let Arthur place a single, thick black folder onto the polished wood. I told him the meeting would be exceptionally brief. I explained that I was not there to negotiate a lease extension, nor was I there to entertain desperate payment plans. I informed the board, watching the color rapidly drain from their faces, that the anonymous holding company that owned their building, their distribution centers, and their manufacturing hubs was now entirely under my control. I was their landlord, and their time was officially up. My mother finally found her voice, a shrill, trembling whisper accusing me of vindictive corporate sabotage. I didn't even blink. I simply cut her off and instructed Arthur to distribute the copies. Within seconds, every member of the board was staring at the undeniable, meticulously documented proof of a 30-year financial fraud. I watched my mother's carefully constructed legacy evaporate in real time as I verbally walked the board to forge signatures on my grandfather's will. I pointed to the copies of the original engineering patents, proving that the very foundation of the company belonged solely to Aunt Eleanor. I laid every devastating secret bare under the cold fluorescent lights. I explained that the company wasn't failing because of a market downturn. It was failing because it had been built on a rotten foundation of theft and was currently being run by a profoundly incompetent CEO. I looked down at David, who was physically shrinking into his expensive leather chair, unable to make eye contact with anyone. There was no shouting, no dramatic begging from the board. The absolute finality of the legal documents left no room for argument or negotiation. Even their own litigators silently closed their briefcases, recognizing an unwinnable bloodbath. I looked at my mother one last time. Her empire was completely gone. Her reputation among her peers was permanently destroyed. She was left with absolutely nothing. I turned my back on the dead silence of the boardroom and walked out, leaving the ghosts of my past locked inside forever. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive lobby, watching the final act of a 30-year illusion play out on the pavement below. It was a clear, crisp afternoon, completely unlike the freezing rain of the day they threw me out. Down on the street, my mother and David were carrying ordinary cardboard boxes to a waiting taxi. There were no sleek town cars, no entourage of sycophants. Just two people, entirely stripped of their stolen armor, fading into the anonymous crowd of the bustling city. My legal team had spent the morning preparing the extensive briefs required to pursue criminal fraud and embezzlement charges for the forged wills and the stolen patents. But as I watched them load the trunk in absolute silence, I turned to Arthur and told him to shred the files. Dragging them through a decade of bitter criminal court proceedings would only tether my energy to their dysfunction. For people whose entire existence relied on unearned prestige and the ability to control others, absolute obscurity and total irrelevance was a far heavier sentence than any judge could ever hand down. I didn't want their punishment. I simply wanted my peace. I turned away from the glass and left the building for the final time. The drive back up the Pacific Coast Highway felt fundamentally different that evening. The heavy, invisible chain that had dragged behind me for 20 years was finally severed. I drove with the windows down, letting the coastal wind rush through the cabin, carrying away the last lingering remnants of my former life. When the wrought iron gates of the estate opened, I didn't just see a massive piece of real estate. I saw a sanctuary built on undeniable truth. I walked to the grand foyer, the antique skeleton key resting comfortably in my pocket, and made my way out onto the vast stone terrace. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the expansive sky in deep, breathtaking hues of violet, amber, and gold. The rhythmic, endless crashing of the waves against the cliffs below filled the silence, a powerful, steady heartbeat that anchored me to the present moment. I leaned against the heavy stone balustrade, breathing in the cold, salt-tinged air. For the first time in my entire adult life, my chest didn't physically ache with anxiety. Aunt Eleanor had given me an empire, but the money and the holding company were never her true legacy. Her greatest gift was forcing me to finally look in the mirror and recognize my own absolute worth. For decades, I had allowed profoundly broken people to convince me that my value was solely defined by how much pain I could absorb on their behalf. I had mistaken their ruthless exploitation for family love and my own endless submission for honorable loyalty. But standing there in the fading light, the truth was as clear as the ocean water. Stepping out of the shadow of a toxic family isn't an act of betrayal. It is the ultimate act of profound self-preservation. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. You owe absolutely nothing to the people who only ever loved the parts of you they could extract and use. My grandfather's legacy was hijacked, and Eleanor's genius was stolen, but this new chapter belongs entirely to me. I will use this foundation not to hoard power, but to protect the peace I paid such a heavy price to attain. The emotional scars of the past 20 years will always remain, serving as a quiet, stoic reminder of what I survived, but they no longer dictate where I am going. My future is finally, beautifully, my own, if my journey has resonated with you today. If you have ever found yourself sacrificing your own light just to keep someone else warm, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and share this story with someone who might desperately need the strength to finally walk away. Sometimes the hardest, most painful endings are the only possible way to find your true beginning. Thank you for listening.